Chapter 25, Bitter Truths. I will admit, not totally happy with this chapter. It's still a bit choppy, but it had been far too long since an update. Tuesday, September 10th. With Umbridge out of the way, if only temporarily, the mood in Gryffindor was quite festive. Even those who looked askance at Harry had come to fear the woman, and most Gryffindors preferred wand-waving to bookwork anyhow. Maybe they'll get Snape to teach it again, like in third year, Ron said. The man's a git, but anybody's better than Umbridge, he spat. Neville listened quietly as he wrote in his new potions journal. He'd never felt so included as when Harry had handed him one. Sure, everybody in Gryffindor was nice enough, but Harry and Ron and Hermione were their own group, and Dean and Seamus were best friends and tended to hang out with the Hufflepuffs. Ron was the only other wizard-raised boy in their dorm, and he had stuck fiercely to Harry since the train ride during their first year. Like Hermione, Neville tended to have a lot more friends when projects came due only for herbology, though, whereas poor Hermione had people pestering her for help about everything, though, to be fair, none of the three had used him, so Neville was starting to understand their dynamics a lot better. Harry, though kind and noble and brave beyond Neville's ability to comprehend it, was as painfully shy as Neville himself. In a way, he was overshadowed by Hermione's constant I know, and Ron's loud and boisterous personality. Neville had just assumed that Harry, along with everybody else, had no interest in the clumsy, dumpy boy. He was beginning to realize that Harry had probably assumed that no one besides Ron was interested in Specky Rund. He meticulously filled out an entry for deflating drafts while the other three bickered about who should teach defense and why. "Why don't you teach it, Harry?" he asked, not glancing up from his work. "You've got the most practical experience of any student here, and the teachers are obviously too busy to take care of it." The sudden silence made him glance up. Three gazes were pinned on him. "Neville, that's brilliant," Hermione said. Wednesday, September 11th. Since Professor Umbridge was ill, Snape had ungraciously, publicly, anyway, agreed to take over her detentions. He hadn't even realized that Harry had received detention from her until he'd gotten the paperwork. He hadn't seen a bandage on the boy's hand, so perhaps she hadn't dared mutilate the boy who lived. He never thought he'd be so grateful for Harry's fame. He'd made sure to announce to his fifth-year Slytherin, Gryffindor class that Harry was to come that night for a special detention. Draco had chortled and Weasley had fumed. The other detainees had spent a grueling 2 hours scrubbing cauldrons with toothbrushes. Not their own toothbrushes, unfortunately, but the old ones Snape kept around for that purpose. True, most of them didn't deserve detentions, but they were Hufflepuffs, and everyone knew Hufflepuffs had perpetual diarrhea of the mouth. Besides, they needed toughening anyway. The fact that they almost seemed cheery about the whole thing just made him crankier. He despised being the lesser of two evils. If nothing else, he would punish Umbridge for that indignity. Harry arrived promptly at 8:30 for his detention, wearing his herbology smock over his clothes, obviously prepared for hard work. He looked surprised at the tea laid out. "I had better hear you bemoaning the cruelty you suffered at my hands," Severus said in a stern voice as he poured Harry tea. Harry nodded, hanging his smock over the back of his chair and taking a seat. "The other guys a broken bar?" Harry asked. "They're Hufflepuffs. What do you think?" Harry shrugged. "They seemed pretty chipper, though even scrubbing cauldrons is better than Umbridge." Snape caught Harry's wrist, staring at the back of his hand. "Yes, the marks were faint, but they were there." "It's fine. I pewed a broken bar some stuff on it, and it's fine." "Ah, so that is where my Myrtlap essence went." Yeah. Sorry about that." Severus frowned sternly. "In the future, you will ask. Not steal from my stores. Those ingredients could be needed in an emergency." "Yes, sir," he whispered. "Harry, this is important. You must not defy Umbridge." Seeing the boy's jaw set stubbornly, he added, "We are doing what we can, but if we use resources to defend you, then that limits our efforts to stymie her elsewhere." Seeing the boy's indecision, he added, "Harry, events are moving rapidly in the Ministry. Ultimately, Hogwarts is just a microcosm of that struggle. What happens here means little in the larger picture. What is most important is that the students remain unharmed. If you continue your open defiance, others will follow, and be harmed as a result." Biting his lip, Harry nodded. "Drink your tea," Severus said, trying for a softer tone. The two drank tea and nibbled scones in what Severus hoped was a companionable silence. "You did something to her, Umbridge. I mean," Harry suddenly blurted. "You poisoned her." "I created a potion that, when inhaled in repeated small doses, would engender an extreme allergic reaction." The open horror in Harry's expression made something deep inside Severus cringe. "It was a carefully measured dose. She will come to no permanent harm. Some of the first years are still having nightmares." "It must have been horrible." "Harry, what would you have me do?" "Dumbledore plays games with the wolf at the door must dance to the tune that the ministry sets. For now, she was harming students under our care, my son, and we had to act. What recourse did we have but to strike, and strike hard?" Severus heard the appalling desperation in his own voice. Harry fiddled with his fork. "She'll be okay. She will recover completely," Severus assured him. "Well, good," the boy said, his voice becoming fiercer. "She hurt those kids." Severus restrained a groan as those emerald eyes fired with righteous Gryffindor ire. Saturday, September 14th. Despite Dumbledore's disapproval, the rest of the staff showed a certain quiet appreciation for his amphibious sabotage. Except Filch. The near squib's devotion to the woman was starting to approach fanaticism. It was really quite disturbing. Oblivious to Snape's role in the woman's current condition, he bemoaned the woman's ill health. Snape, of course, sympathized with him, and even brewed special cleaning potions to eliminate the dungeon mold responsible for poor Professor Umbridge's terrible illness. Filch seemed to use them especially thoroughly in the area around his cramped little office, filling the hallway with a smell of oranges and mint. Umbridge would be returning to her duties in a limited fashion on Monday. The other heads had spent the week cautioning their students to exemplary behavior. Sprout, in typical Hufflepuff conflict avoidance, had simply lowered curfew to 7:30 at night. Her badgers would be in effective lockdown for fully half of each day. Sneer though he might, Snape privately admitted he might have done the same. McGonagall, unfortunately, tended to place a high value on propriety. This stopped her from giving direct commands that would reveal her less than flattering opinion of another professor. She contented herself with vague warnings and fierce stares, which only impressed those students who hadn't needed cowing in the first place. Phileas kept his jovial face firmly in place, at least in public. Nevertheless, he had instituted mandatory study sessions and a series of projects that took up most of the Eagles' free time. Severus had to admit that his serpents were thriving on this challenge. At least the best of them were. Draco was quickly acquiring a polish that his father had only gained in his 20s. Bulstrode was emerging from the shadows. The girl was intelligent and more than cunning, but the current situation had sparked her interest and finally caused her to use those gifts. Silly little Parkinson tripping merrily along, ignorant of the veritable bonfire of bridges behind her. While Draco's affluent childhood had made him covetous and arrogant, not entirely bad traits, Parkinson's had made her lazy and petulant. They had won a skirmish or two, but the war was far from over. Friday, September 20th. Following Snape's advice, Harry had been a good boy all week. He read his textbooks thoroughly, except his defense books. Those he skimmed just enough to formulate a series of respectfully annoying questions. Harry arrived at Snape's door at 5 o'clock, his bag crammed full of textbooks. Umbridge seemed reasonably content as long as Harry was miserable, even if someone else was inflicting said misery. Snape opened the door, gesturing Harry towards a B-tube student desk crammed into a corner of his office. "You can study there." He offered Harry a small vial of erudition memoria, and Harry carefully measured an ounce of the potion into the crystal carafe of water. Severus noted with approval the extensive comments in the margins of Harry's books. Promptly at 7, a house elf arrived, quietly setting out a meal and then popping away. Severus always took care to order special meals for Harry high in vegetables and whole grains. While Harry, not being a picky eater, did eat better than many of the children, Ronald Weasley had a multi-course dinner of desserts at least once a week. Severus was not satisfied that he was getting enough truly wholesome food. They lingered over their tea, Harry listening while Severus spoke. Severus had learned the best way to coax Harry into speaking was to speak himself, leaving many pauses but no awkward silences. After an internal debate, Severus made his decision. It was his choice, after all, not Dumbledore's. "Harry, I have something I must tell you, but you must promise that you will not act on this information. Trust that we are handling it," He didn't define who we included. At this point, he wasn't quite sure. Wide-eyed and alarmed, Harry nodded. This summer broken bar Severus cleared his throat. Really? How did one inform someone that their relative's soul had been devoured? It certainly wasn't something Lady Courtesy had ever discussed. This summer, a Dementor visited your home. I'm afraid your Aunt Marge was killed. Dudley's aunt. Not mine, Harry corrected, then looked a bit embarrassed. Sorry, sir. The boy broodingly stared into his teacup. The boy seemed more resigned than upset. A broken bar. I take it that this is not news to you? A broken bar. I heard about it earlier. Choosing his words carefully, Severus said, you could have spoken to me about it if you were upset. Harry gave him a strange little smile. I wanted to see if Dumbledore would actually tell me something before I almost got killed. Severus just stared in shock. My son, that I am sure of. Chapter 26, My Fellow Conspirators. Wednesday, September 25th. Harry sat silently, watching Sirius wolf the food he brought from the corner of his eye. He hung around Hagrid's hut for a half-hour or so after his Wednesday lessons. Sometimes Sirius would appear, and sometimes not. He seemed content enough to remain in his dog form, often simply leaning against Harry. On Tuesdays Harry had to hurry to herbology, so he'd hide the stash he'd smuggled from lunch under a distinctive rock. The longer he was gone from Grimmauld Place, the healthier Sirius seemed. Harry had never seen the place himself, but it had to be absolutely horrid. So, Umbridge seems to be pretty much ignoring me. Snape gives me detention all the time, and the Slytherins all gloat about it. It's a good time to study, really. Very quiet. I usually do my potions homework, 'cause I can ask him questions right then. He's recommended a ton of really helpful books. Snuffles nodded wisely as he gnawed at an apple. Harry made a mental note to pick up some plastic wrap. Everything but bread, cheese, or fruit just got mangled in his pockets, even if he wrapped it in a napkin. He told me about Marge. She's Dudley's aunt. He said some Dementors killed her this summer. Harry shuddered, his hand clutching at Snuffles' thick fur for a moment. They had to be after me. Why else would they have been there? Snuffles licked Harry's face, then rested his massive head on Harry's shoulder. Professor Snape said not to worry about it, that it was being handled. I think I can trust him about this, you know? He doesn't just blow stuff off. Since Snuffles seemed to be in agreement, Harry pushed the matter to the back of his mind. Sunday, September 29th. He said it has certain unique protections, Harry said, fiddling with the flower earring. Yuck, it's so girly. Ron grimaced. Yeah, well, apparently some Slytherin made it for his wife, so only my lawfully wedded husband can remove it. He seems to find that funny. Ron grunted. Sicko. Tell me about it. Hermione was thumbing through one of the several dozen volumes on the Slytherin family in the Hogwarts library. Harry and Ron were studying the pictures in the books, looking for images of the ring, while Hermione was using an indexing charm she'd learned to quickly search each book for mentions of rings. She'd tried to teach it to the boys, but it was too complex for Ron. It was a 7th-year charm, so she really couldn't fault him. He had genuinely tried, and apparently too delicate for Harry. He'd shredded multiple issues of Witch Weekly and the Daily Prophet into confetti in his attempts to learn the charm. Hermione tried to feel genuine remorse of the destruction of Lavender and Parvati's reading material. She really did. If a few of her own books with titles like Stormy Passions and The Pirate's Temptation were also sacrificed to the cause, well, it was really no one else's business, was it? Maybe that's it, Ron said, sounding dubious. I don't think so, Harry said, studying the picture Ron pointed to. He placed a scrap of paper in the book anyway, marking the place. Hermione sighed in irritation as she came across yet another overblown description of the custom wedding ring of a Slytherin bride or groom. Her current book was a collection of Daily Prophet articles mentioning the Slytherin family, if only in passing. She had been surprised, and appalled, that such a book existed. A broken bar until she came across ones focusing on many old families, including the Malfoys, Knots, Bones, Longbottoms, and Carmichaels. Apparently it had been a fashion a century ago, since all of them were painfully accurate until approximately 1900. Each book contained reams of dull announcements of weddings, births, and graduations. The Slytherin book was immense, thicker than the London telephone directory, even with the charms placed on it to make thinner and more manageable. She was scouring another wedding announcement when Harry said, "That's it." Christabel Slytherin and Isolde Tomlin, Ron read. Christabel had what Hermione had come to think of as the Slytherin look, which Harry had in spades, much to her discomfiture. Though Christabel's eyes were blue, they had the same exotic tilt as Harry's. And the chin and the nose were classic Slytherin. Isolde was surprisingly plain, with brown eyes, curly brown hair, and a short, round figure, a plough horse next to a thoroughbred, Hermione thought. The hand that Christabel clasped in his own manicured one did indeed sport Harry's ring. Hermione missed Harry's old thick-framed, hideous, really, glasses. His new glasses only seemed to emphasize his features, giving him the aristocratic looks that many of the pureblood shared. Of course, the Potters were an old family as well, and a lot of Harry's looks had come from his dad. Still, if she hadn't known already, she would have been hard-pressed to decide who was Harry's father, James Potter or Tom Riddle. She leaned over Harry's shoulder, examining the entry. November 30th, 1754 was written in graceful calligraphy beneath the painting. Eagerly they read the brief biographies. Lord Christabel Slytherin, December 12, 1711 – July 5, 1866. Long-lived lot, weren't they? Ron said, impressed. Hogwarts, Ravenclaw, Newts, Charms, Potions, Transfiguration, Ancient Runes, Thaumaturgy, Accreditations, Royal Guild of Charms Masters, 1740, Academy of Organic Magics, Spain, 1739, Mary Isolde Tomlin May 8, 1742, Lady Isolde Slytherin née Tomlin, March 21, 1713 – November 2, 1849, Hogwarts, Hufflepuff, Newts, Charms, Arithmancy, Ancient Runes, Herbology, Geomancy, Accreditation, Geomancer Society of France, 1740. Children, Clara, August 15, 1743, Benjamin, October 29, 1751, bunch of overachievers, Ron said. What the heck's thaumaturgy anyway? Magical creatures, Harry and Hermione said at the same time. Ron huffed. Whatever. Hermione scanned the title of the book, Portraiture of House Slytherin, 1300 to 1900, as the title promised. The book was a massive tome with every portrait of a Slytherin family member. Each merited the same brief description. Ron thumbed through the book in aggravation. Well, that's a fat lot of nothing. Now that we know their names and ages, I can narrow my search. She lifted her wand, casting her indexing charm anew. Harry and Ron seized other books as well, looking for references to the couple. After wading through numerous clippings mentioning galas, donations, Hermione finally found something interesting. Listen to this. Dated March 12, 1751, Lady Isolde Slytherin, wife of Lord Christabel Slytherin, was admitted to St. Mungo's on March 7, despite obstructions to our innocent inquiries. The Daily Prophet has learned that she is recovering from an attack by an unidentified dark creature in a private ward. I wonder what sort of dark creature? Unfortunately for Hermione's curiosity, the next article mentioning Lady Isolde, dated over a year later, was only an announcement of the donation of a collection of rare books to the Hogwarts library. Well, I think we can assume, for the moment, that the ring was made in response to this attack. I wonder who made it? Hermione said. Well, she was a geomancer, and bone is organic, isn't it? Maybe they made it themselves, Harry said. You think so? Hermione said, her eyes going soft and misty. How romantic. Harry and Ron inched their chairs away. Mushiness could be contagious, after all. Harry hated to admit it, but the research into his newly discovered heritage had been a good idea. Amid the dark witches and wizards, and there were more than a few of those, were professors, healers, and powerful light witches and wizards, though not so many as there were dark. It was rather heartening, really, and like Voldemort had said, more than one Slytherin had married a former hostage. Saturday, October 5th. Let's call it Dumbledore's army, Hermione said, carried away with rebellion and enthusiasm. Really, Harry thought, it's always the quiet tone as a broken bar. Well, the well-behaved ones, at least. Hermione, after browbeating him into submission, had taken Neville's idea and run with it. The Hog's Head was crowded with students ordering butterbeer and lemonade, leaving the regulars to sulk and nurse their ale and fire whiskey. After all, having a bunch of cheerful, neatly dressed students really ruined a good bad reputation. Aloud, he said, look, Let's not make this political, alright? This is just about people learning to defend themselves. Everybody is welcome, if they sign the parchment, regardless of their family history or beliefs or anything else." He signed his name with a flourish, and tried not to blush when Cho smiled at him, drawing a Chinese character under his name with a graceful hand. Monday, October 7th, Ron fumed and scanned the hall for suspiciously blotchy faces as Umbridge beamed after making the announcement. "Quidditch," he hissed. "She can't cancel Quidditch. That's a broken bar that's like canceling Christmas. It's unholy." "Honestly, Ron, it's just a game," Hermione sighed, utterly exasperated by Ron's nearly 10-minute rant. Ron stared at the girl with horror, then pointedly turned his back on her to say to Dean, "Quidditch. If that's not an act of terrorism." A broken bar. Dean nodded, appropriately solemn. Harry grinned at Hermione and whispered, "Shouldn't have gone there." "Well, at least he's nattering at somebody else now," she said, paging through Hogwarts, a history. Harry's reply caught in his throat when he spotted Hedwig making a limping circle towards him. He touched her injured wing and leg with trembling fingers. She hooted comfortingly. "I'm sure Hedwig will be fine, Harry," Hermione said soothingly. "Yeah, Dobby will take great care of her," Ron agreed. Harry nodded, fingers nervously folding and refolding the strap of his book bag. Hedwig might very well have died out there, and Harry would never have known. He almost hoped he was being singled out. He hated the idea of any owl suffering. Scarier still was the knowledge that they were almost completely cut off. The Flu network was becoming suspiciously unreliable. And suddenly, the Ravenclaws and Hufflepuffs seemed to be spending all of their time in their common rooms, leaving just the Gryffindors and Slytherins roaming the halls. Without the buffers of the other houses, the long-standing snake-lion rivalry was escalating. Severus Snape was very displeased. That a broken bar. That woman, that ministry stooge, who had only managed a single newt, in Charms of All Things, and a week acceptable at that, was inspecting his class. The fact that she seemed to be flirting with him only worsened matters. She smiled and nodded and took notes, making it obvious that she planned to make a glowing report on him to the ministry, and expecting him to be grateful for it. He forced himself to be polite, even conciliatory, to the woman as she simpered at him. He reluctantly returned to his old teaching pattern, praising and rewarding the Slytherins, especially the inquisitorial squad, for anything other than abject failure in berating the Gryffindors. To his relief, Harry seemed to understand, and even created opportunities for him to take points. Though he did feel a bit guilty when Longbottom surreptitiously wiped his eyes on his sleeve. He assigned Harry a detention when Draco whinged about the smoke from Harry's cauldron hurting his eyes. Reluctantly ending the class, he gritted his teeth and accepted when that woman invited him for tea in her office. "Professor Snape, my eyes hurt." "What?" Harry mocked. "Really, Draco? Could you be more horribly spoiled?" Draco grinned and shrugged. The pair was hiding out in a disused classroom. Millicent had suggested that it might be easier to protect Potter if Potter himself was in on it. Draco had reluctantly agreed, and had been pleasantly surprised by Potter's gleeful participation in their plans. Now that he knew Potter wasn't too goody-good to enjoy a good conspiracy, he was beginning to relish his role as one of Umbridge's underlings. Well, certain aspects of it. He'd accumulated reams of blackmail material in the last month or so. As long as somebody's persecuting you, Umbridge can concentrate on Dumbledore. Harry's grin faltered. "I feel like I should be doing something to help." Draco bit his tongue. Criticizing Dumbledore wasn't going to help his case with Harry. "Look, Potter, don't be so nice." Macron v. "Dumbledore's been playing these games since your grandparents went to school here. The best thing you can do to help him is keep your head down and get out of his way." "You're probably right. It just seems a broken bar cowardly." Voldemort frowned, sifting through the pile of reports from all over the world. Perhaps his undermining of Dumbledore's authority and bolstering of Fudge's had been a miscalculation. The reports he was receiving from Hogwarts were disturbing. Over a decade of laziness, greed, and eager sycophantism, a broken bar, and now, of all times, Fudge takes decisive, even creative, action. Really, it was most irritating. He'd placed the overzealous and intractable Umbridge woman at Hogwarts, rather than one of Malfoy's bought and paid for mouthpieces. Perhaps a third player was interfering in his puppet show. Until now, All strings had lead either to him or to Dumbledore. Though his plan seemed to be proceeding apace on all other fronts, the giants were with him, despite Hagrid's efforts. Did Dumbledore really think sending a half-breed outcast would benefit his cause? Fenrir Greyback had only grown more powerful among the werewolves since the war, and Remus Lupin's credibility had eroded away. The vampires were sending a delegation on the winter solstice. Severus assured him the Hogwarts situation was stabilizing. Perhaps if he provided the Ministry with other opportunities to neuter Dumbledore, they would turn their attention away from Hogwarts and Harry.